So thank you very much. I have explained that I deny tension and fear. So I'll just plunge right in. So thank you so much, Patrick, for inviting me. When reading Jacques Rancière's forays into political philosophy and aesthetics, I've often thought about the title of Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations, which were published together for the first time in 1876. Today I decided to do something with that thought. You know, I've been thinking about this for years. Now it's time to do something with it. I realized that there is more than one good reason to do so when trying to understand how one can blend the time and the goals of criticism and philosophy in an independent approach to both these intellectual activities. Today, I will talk about the book that Rancière first published in 1999, which is Mute Speech, but I will start trying to address this in this larger discussion. I'm only going to comment really on the structure of Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations. The 4 essays that compose it had been published separately between 1873 and 1876. The first one talked about David Strauss and the book that he had published in 1873, David Strauss, The Confessor and the Writer. The second one deals on the uses and disadvantages of history in life from a theoretical standpoint and addresses precisely the temporal dimension of human knowledge and action. However, references to German contemporaries or recently deceased icons are also made, in particular to Goethe, Hegel, and Hartmann. The third meditation was a reflection on the legacy of Schopenhauer as educator, as Nietzsche tried to come to grip with who he himself wanted to be within the larger German philosophical arena. The fourth one was about Richard Wagner in Bayreuth and the inauguration of Wagner's famous theater in 1872. Here Nietzsche still embraces Wagner's, we know he'll break up later, but here he still embraces Wagner's musical and artistic project as an inspiration for young German philosophers such as himself. Although at the end, a more pessimistic note announces his later disillusionment. I really want to retain for today 2 aspects of this structure, of the structure of this book. First of all, the fact that the book is composed as a commentary on the work of German, either icons or German contemporaries, especially for the first and the fourth essays, but internally also in the second and the third. In this sense, then, they're very timely with respect to a certain cultural context. But there is a second aspect of this structure that interests me, which is that these relatively time and space specific remarks are brought out from what could still be called the sphere of criticism because they start addressing some issues philosophically. That is, what precisely? That's what interests me. This is, in fact, part of the question that I want to raise unworthily, and I will just say prefatory that, like a very minimalistic remark on philosophy is that this is a discourse such that today I still want to read Nietzsche commenting on Strauss and Wagner, although I'm not interested in either and know little about mid-19th century German philosophy and might not ever really get into that. I don't know. You know, I might, but I don't think so. What I'm looking for, in fact, why? I don't know. But I guess that what I'm looking for, in fact, is the early expressions of Nietzsche's philosophical notions, which, as Plato's or Kant's, can be useful in the more untimely realm of speculation. Now, going from Nietzsche to Rancière, unworthily, it is clear that all those familiar with his work, that the simultaneously timely and untimely aspect of his reflection is pronounced, more readable than, say, in Kant, although maybe less explicit than in the untimely meditations. In particular, in mute speech, the issue of the historicity of philosophy and its relation to criticism occurs in a specific field, that of the definition of literature, itself treated by Rancière in a timely, untimely way, I believe. That is, both in a historicist and what I will call here an evental manner. In a way, then, posing the problem of the historicity or the eventality of literature, such as Rancière defines it in mute speech, allows us maybe to glance at Rancière's way of practicing philosophy. Today, I will consider this issue along three main axes: the book's own historicity in French literary criticism, then its place, the book's place in Rancière's own temporality as a philosopher, and lastly, the place that history itself is given in the definition of the question, what is literature, that is at the core of mute speech. This last part is in a way the most important, but also the most difficult one, because my aim is not so much to assign mute speech a place within French intellectual history, although, as we will see, Rancière's this resistance to this model, to the model of intellectual history, needs to be addressed, but to formulate a more precise account of its main thesis and the reasons for their enduring relevance and appeal in today's debates about the political import of aesthetic practices almost 20 years later, right? So first, literature in a fraught critical terrain. The main object of mute speech is to retrace the shift that occurred around the end of the 18th century in the history and practice of what came then to be called literature, as opposed to the preceding practice of belles lettres. Rancière briefly talked about this yesterday. This shift is, in fact, nothing less than, and I quote Rancière, a silent revolution. The turning point coincided, of course, with the theories expressed by the German Romantics in the late 1790s, and according to Rancière, its tenets had yet to be reversed at the end of the 20th century. The pre-Romantic practice of literature was dominated by four main principles derived from, and I quote Rancière, a particular idea of the relations between speech and action. So there were these aspects: fiction, genre, propriety, in French, convenance, and authorial presence. At the beginning of the 19th century, however, fiction has been replaced by expression and mimesis by an expanded understanding of poiesis. This movement, in turn, ruined all generic conventions and their traditional expectations in terms of propriety, representation, and authorial accountability. What is important is the way in which Rancière builds the critical space in which this argument needs to be received. My intent is not to establish influences or debts, intellectual debts, but to present the stakes of Rancière's intervention in a specific critical conjoncture. As is often the case for a philosopher who has always kept a combative bent, I think, a characteristic, by the way, that Nietzsche attributed also to Schopenhauer, Rancière's point of departure is a book published in 1991 by Gérard Genette that was called Fiction and Diction, Fiction and Diction. Genette, at the time, had started his own excursus into the res literaria, questioning the wisdom of trying to answer the question famously raised by Sartre in 1948, what is literature? Genette, however, goes on defying all fear of ridicule and does, in fact, end up proposing a remarkably coherent understanding of the different kinds of literature that can be practiced. Rancière, however, is this sort of prefatory reference to Genette. Rancière retains only the challenge posed by Genette's ironic comment. And I quote Rancière, "There are some questions that we no longer dare pose. Recently, an eminent literary theorist, Genette, said that one would have to have no fear of ridicule to call a book what is literature. For, as Gérard Genette tells us, a foolish question does not require an answer. By the same token, true wisdom might consist in not asking it at all." And end of quote. But Genette, in fact, did go on and propose a very concrete approach to the question that Rancière decides not to engage with at all. As it behooves a formalist critic greatly influenced by pragmatic linguistics, Genette, to a certain sense also Wittgenstein, Genette structures his description of the literary object in terms of linguistic inflection, that is, of literariness understood as that, and I quote Genette, Fiction and Diction, understood as that which makes a verbal message a work of art, end of quote. Genette is faithful to the structural tradition and gives a purely descriptive list of aesthetic techniques, such as metaphor, voice, narration, that characterize certain uses of language as a work of art. The historical, philosophical characterization of literature in the singular does not interest him, since Genette is quite happy to recognize that this word covers, and I quote Genette, several things at once, things that are connected, for example, by rather loose bond of what Wittgenstein called family resemblance and are difficult or perhaps impossible to consider simultaneously. So that was Genette's approach. Rancière, in fact, does something different. He chooses to talk about literature in the singular, following the lead of other French theorists of the time, whose own tenets are closer to his own. That is speculative and historical rather than pragmatic. The most immediate reference is another book, although much older, published by Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe in 1978. Let me turn this off.
At least it's yours, right?
Right. Oh, God.
We'll edit that out.
I won't even tell you who it was. Rancière chooses instead to talk, in fact, about literature in the singular, etc. The most immediate reference is another older book published by Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe in 1978, which was called L'Absolu littéraire, which is an essential point of reference for Rancière because he references it in mute speech quite often. As his understanding of the romantic theory of literature coincides with Nancy's and Lacoue-Labarthe's thesis. Accordingly, a description of the literary object as the product of a certain linguistic technique is insufficient from a philosophical perspective, heavily inflected on the one hand by Kant's theory of the subject and its reprisal in German idealism, and on the other by Heidegger's reading of modernity and Derrida's critique of the presence of speech. It is within the group of the Athenaeum between roughly 1796 and 1802 that something as literature in the singular comes into being. Instead of a linguistic practice, literature becomes both a subject and an object of speculation, defined not by certain works that can be assigned to it, but as a subjective, all-encompassing project. It's a project that's all-encompassing, however it might be deferred and incomplete in its realization. The project is encompassing. According to this model, then, and I still quote Nancy and Lacoue-Labarthe, philosophy then controls romanticism. It should be clear that Kant is a far more powerful antecedent for Rancière's embracing of literature than Heidegger, although I unworthily mentioned him. In fact, it becomes clear quite soon that one of the most important aspects of German theory is its conception of literature and art in general as the free play of the imagination, whose subject operates not the representation, but the creation of a world. For Rancière, whose interest in the literary fact is mostly tied, as we will see, to issues of emancipation and community creation, this is an essential passage, and I quote Rancière. The passage from a poetics of representation to a poetics of expression overturns the hierarchy of relations among them. In opposition to language considered as an instrument of demonstration and exemplification addressed to a qualified auditor, it promotes a conception of language as a living body of symbols, that is, expressions that both show and hide what they say, that not so much show a particular determinate thing as the nature and history of language as world or community creating power, end of quote. It is because of this new faith in the power of literature to express, if not the fullness of an idea, at least its freely produced fragments, that the relation between the writer and his or her work changes irreversibly during the Romantic era. There is even an anarchist, subversive aspect to the way in which literature deals with language. It came to a surprise to me when I read Mute Speech to see Rancière take up almost literally the reading given by Jacques Derrida of Plato's rendition of Socrates' account of the origins of writing in Phaedrus, without, however, mentioning it. Like, there are references to Nancy and Lacoue-Labarthe in the footnotes, but not to Derrida. But I thought, but this is the same passage. What happened here? It is in
many people commented on it.
Okay, so it was a coincidence. It is, in fact, through the issue of the orphaned utterance contained in the tablets presented by Theut to King Thamus that the potentially revolutionary power of the destruction of any restricted scene of speech is affirmed. Because it can be appropriated, and that's exactly, you're right, because it can be appropriated by any and everybody, writing goes against the Republican symphony, enacting instead what Rancière calls, and I quote, democratic anarchy. We will see very shortly that this is a fundamental aspect of Rancière's interest in literature. To a limited extent, however, Derrida is replaced by one of his favorite predecessors, Maurice Blanchot, who, for Rancière, is the latest incarnation of the romantic belief in the unique character of the literary work, in its relation with the absolute as absence, sketched in Blanchot's book to come. Presented by Rancière as the anti-Jeannette par excellence.
No, the anti-Voltaire.
I'm sorry, but the anti-Voltaire par excellence, that's a mistake. Blanchot emphasizes the unresolved, not quite dialectical tension between presence and absence that guarantees both the integrity and the freedom of the literary project. Although Rancière seems to consider Blanchot's use of the word literature quite, and I quote, extraordinary. Radical or not, Blanchot is nonetheless presented as a 20th century incarnation of romantic aesthetics. And it's, in fact, it is from Blanchot's own literary pantheon that Rancière also find the majority of writers that he comments on very often, Mallarmé, Flaubert, Proust, the Surrealists. However, Blanchot's rarefied, non-referential perspective on the literary fact is not really what Rancière needs. It is clear that for Rancière, what is essential is to maintain the democratic or even anarchist perspective on literature opened up by certain reading of Romanticism, or maybe even of writing tout court. So it's a coincidence that it is similar to Derrida's, but it's that sort of push. This is all the more important as it is at this theoretical juncture that Rancière will be able to elaborate.
That's for you,
Time to go. To elaborate a holistic political theory of aesthetics. So the second part would be literature in Rancière's own philosophical trajectory. It will not come as a surprise that Rancière's first sustained forays into aesthetics should mainly, not only, address the literary fact. As is well known, the archival documents pertaining to the journals and poetic works published by socialist workers in the mid-19th century had been key in shaping Rancière's own theoretical escape from Althusser and other Marxist theories of ideology. In fact, among the young philosophers that had co-authored Lire le Capital, Rancière is not the only one to have tried to tie literature to the issue of political agency. In particular, Pierre Macheret had written in 1966, long time ago, a materialist discussion of literature that was significantly titled A Theory of Literary Production, which had fully inserted the writer into the web of capitalist production of ideology and social organization. Maybe even more importantly, because it's closer to Rancière's book, Macheret had published another book that was called À quoi pense la littérature? What does literature think about? Which addressed the relation of philosophy and literature in the works of several authors belonging to the post-Romantic era. Macheret there had adopted a kind of a strictly historical outlook without presenting a unified theory of literature or of the artistic fact. But so it is quite evident that while Rancière does not mention Macheret at all, mute speech, I think, can also be read a bit as an anti-Macheret, which takes as point of departure an incontrovertible archival discovery. Neither a product of ideology nor a purely historical derivation of idealist philosophy, for the workers who thought themselves how to read and write in the 19th century, literature had indisputably been the place of emancipation and discursive freedom. These archival experiences and the reflections that they sparked in Rancière were the object of his earliest independent works, notably The Knights of Labor, originally published in 1981, and The Philosopher and is poor, which followed in 1983. According to Rancière, behind the negative arguments given to the works of these people in the name of taste or artistic ability, the literature produced by the workers was criticized because of its, and I quote, unseemliness. It is just not proper for a worker to write poetry at night. The very fact that the workers did indeed do so was a political act, much more shocking than any labor-related demand or strike, because it implied a deeper sharing with the privileged classes than financial privilege, the relation with language, sensibility, and understanding. In The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Rancière clarifies how the ability to master language and all the arts fostered by this basic human faculty is the guarantor of a fundamental and always retrievable equality. And in this agreement, he then proceeds to evince the political consequences of this discovery, showing how the ability of the people to speak has always been the object of negation, or at least of containment. I think it's natural then that in the 1990s, Rancière would start interrogating the oldest of language arts, in a way, literature, in the context of the different ways that political power tries to forget the ultimate truth of the absolute equality guaranteed by the access to language. While the details of the articulation of the politics of language in general are not in the purview of my talk, it is quite clear, though, that they explain at least two important aspects of Rancière's interest in the literary fact. First of all, they establish the centrality of literature in the discussion of political matters, and secondly, they insert the historical configuration of literature in the history of the people's struggle for equality. The publication of mute speech, therefore, with its periodization of the literary form, in fact, anticipates another kind of periodization, which, however, is interestingly expunged from this particular book. The book does not talk of political context or an event, but the older classical aesthetics founded on the four main principles of fiction, genre, propriety, and authorial presence is presented in a self-referential theoretical context, and not in this book to the politics of various forms of class and political assignation in different kinds of ancien regime. The aesthetics of freedom and autonomy promoted by Kant, Schiller, and the German Romantics is not analyzed in connection, for instance, with the sudden visibility of the people during the French Revolution. This peculiar omission notwithstanding, two things are clear. Not only does Rancière need literature in order to bolster a certain understanding of politics, but he needs the democratic literature theorized by the German Romantics. Even most importantly, he needs to affirm that the possibilities opened by that understanding still define literature today, at the end of the 20th century. The temporality assigned to these different political and aesthetical regimes reproduces the one assigned to literature. The era of belles lettres coincides with the larger representative regime, while the new age of literature inaugurated by the German Romantics becomes the harbinger of the aesthetic regime, where, and I quote, the identification of art no longer occurs via a division within ways of being, of doing and making, but it is based on distinguishing a sensible mode of being specific to artistic products and frees it from any specific rule, end of quote. Yesterday, Rancière talked about modernism, modernity, but generally he avoids the term. Rancière's reluctance to designate the aesthetic regime under the more common appellation of modernity has the distinct advantage of allowing Rancière to disassociate himself from many of his contemporaries, and notably the French theorists of postmodernity, such as Jean-François Lyotard and Jean Baudrillard, but also other thinkers of postmodern apocalypse, such as Giorgio Agamben. If there is no close time frame that we can call modernity, postmodernity and its apocalyptic political vision do not need to be true. As long as literature is still the place for the appearance of equality inaugurated by the aesthetic revolution, it will have a fundamentally affirmative presence in the public arena. In mute speech, as in Rancière's later writings, the literary enterprise of the aesthetic regime needs to be reaffirmed because of its egalitarian nature. Quite importantly, Rancière will extend this ability also later on to visual arts and cinema. For him, the essentially linguistic nature of our apprehension of visual phenomena, such as images and sequences, prevents us from ever becoming a completely passive consumer of ideology and so-called popular culture. We find this thesis in The Future of the Image that was published originally in 2007 and in The Emancipated Spectator, which followed in 2008. Now I go to the third part of my presentation. That's called Literature Between Historicity and the Event. Now that we have retraced some of the history of mute speech within a certain contemporary critical context and the stakes of its theorization for political uses, I can sketch the main contours of the peculiar, even paradoxical kind of maybe literary history practiced by the book. The paradox would be that the temporal unfolding that Rancière assigns to the very concept of literature, in this book detached from other material phenomena, such as socio-political institutions, technical innovation, the evolution of capitalist modes of production, mass public education, and so forth. So that it's a strange kind of historicity because it is a periodization to a certain extent, but not social in a way. Of course, I'm not the first one to notice the tension. Gabriel Rockhill, in fact, has expressed a critique of Rancière's position on literary aesthetics along similar lines. Rockhill finds that Rancière develops a history of theoretical principles according to a historical logicism, I quote Rockhill, that omits the specificity of practices and institutions in the broadest sense of the term, end of quote. The same criticism has been made also of Rancière's account of the history of democracies and the dissensual practices that it implies. I believe that even the apparent resemblance between Rancière's delineation of literary and aesthetic regimes and Foucault's discontinuous epistemèse, first presented in The Order of Things, is much less determining than it might appear. The two thinkers share an equal reluctance to rely on Marxist categories such as ideology and also a certain fondness for the archival find. And they both insist, and I quote, on the necessity of examining practices in conjunction with the theoretical discourses that establish the conditions by which these are perceived, end of quote. However, there is a fundamental affirmative, empowering trust in Rancière that is absent from Foucault. While in the 1960s, Foucault's debt to Blanchot also, and a vision of literature as an attempt precisely to escape a certain authoritarian derive of language, an epistemic system is quite strong. Foucault doesn't subscribe to a maybe post-Kantian theory of the autonomy of the aesthetic fact. In fact, his later writings, talking about Foucault, seem to go in the opposite direction. And also, Foucault's death, sort of in 1984, if I'm not mistaken, prevents us to know how his thought might have evolved and possibly intersected or not with Rancière's. In fact, what Rockhill has called, and I quote, the radical historicism of Rancière's spare rendition of the battle between opposing partitions of the sensible is historical more in its argumentative unfolding than its constitutive material context. We see that time and again this battle is already located by Rancière himself in the Greek polis, where, as we have seen, the anarchist potential of the latter, far from first revealing itself to the German romantics, is already subjected to a full critique by Plato. Since, differently from Foucault, Rancière does not give an account, however brief or hypothetical, of the impact of Christianity in the constitution of the modern man, there is a certain tendency in his historical practices to leave the historical understanding of certain material facts in favor of what I want to call here their eventality, the fact that they happen, they are events. It is, I believe, this tendency that allows him to treat the emergence of the romantic concept of literature and its presumed contemporary survival without addressing issues related to certain external socio-economic determination, which in fact have remained at the core, for instance, of Pierre Macheret's theories. This is also why it does in fact matter, at least to me, whether it is literature or writing in general that contains an anarchist democratic potential because of the specific temporality assigned to the former by Rancière himself, while Derrida considered the latter, writing, a generic propriety of the practice itself. Similarly, I think, Rancière's critique of Gilles Deleuze's reading of Proust at the end of Mute Speech is related to the supposed adherence on the part of Proust to a post-romantic concept of literature, while Deleuze had underscored the centrifugal impetus, that what is not ideal, what is not part of the project, of the romantic project, the centrifugal impetus that continuously threatens and even overwhelms Proust's declared intention to build a fully coherent Mallarmian book about the aesthetic apprehension of time. Rancière says, and I quote Rancière, that there are no grounds for constructing a coherence of Proustian schizophrenia that would neglect the architectural will. End of quote. This is really not the place to discuss this. What is important is that for Rancière, it is important to detach the theorization of literature and aesthetics in general from unconscious categories, as they would tend to question and undermine the freedom and autonomy of the linguistic subject. This is why I believe it is important to turn to a staunch proponent of the evental constitution of the subject of speech, such as Alain Badiou, who has declared after decades of philosophical, like maybe detachment, a deep affinity with some of Rancière's theses and the need, and I quote Badiou, to salute this extraordinary gesture of the activation of the archives, something that, in my opinion, is more efficient and less melancholic than Foucault's earlier achievements, that's for sure, end of quote. Badiou has spent the better part of the last 4 decades in the elaboration of a complex and idiosyncratic mathematic-based theory of the event. For him, what processes of truth, there are processes of truth which are encounters with the permanent validity of revelations that occur in historical settings but maintain their value in another temporality that is both past and future. This kind of conception might be closer to Rancière's understanding of the autonomy of the literary subject that was powerfully conceptualized by the German Romantics, while Rancière, after a common engagement in the political movements in May 1968, took a completely different philosophical route than Badiou. It is evident, though, that for him, at least two of the generic procedures of what Badiou calls subjective constitution are also not only central, but always retrievable. This is why I believe they share at least one fundamental literary reference, like repeated person that gets quoted, that is the poetry of Mallarmé, who more than anyone else in France, at least, exemplifies the effort to, and I quote Rancière, fix spirit upon the page to assure the materiality of the idea by identifying the space of performance with the space of the book. And I'm going to eliminate. Literature then, in mute speech, remains caught, as it were, between historicity and the event. I hope that I've explained that. A position that is shared by other concepts and material practices dear to Rancière, such as politics and the artistic gesture in general, from painting to cinema. Faced with the power of this enduring conviction, it is hardly relevant whether we're fully convinced, first by Rancière's definition of the Romantic project, and second, with its persistence in the 20th century. One might say that a work of literature in the sense given to it by Rancière, and I don't believe that Rancière would be against this, but anyway, that maybe a work of literature in the sense given to it by Rancière has never been written at all, as books and works of art, for that matter, do not appear in a vacuum but are produced, such as plays, television shows, or more recently YouTube videos. So there is literature and then there are literary works. These considerations certainly alert us to an aspect of the materiality of literature that, in my opinion, cannot be reduced to the simple manifestation of the infinitely retrievable nature of the potentiality of language, and to a certain extent might even sort of nuance the definition of this possibility. However, there is a great political value in Rancière's conviction that the space for a rare, eventual encounter with the autonomous subject of linguistic freedom remains always open, although this can only occur, and I quote, at the cost of accepting the infinite shadow between the constructed book and the printed book, between the plot of discovery and the revealed truth, end of quote. It is in literature that the project of actualizing, and I quote, the coincidence between the trace of history, the sign of writing, and the mark of the will to art can realize itself. Whether this project finds its imaginary realization in the past or in the future, or indeed in no temporal realization whatsoever, and I think the issue of temporality was also central to Rancière's talk yesterday, might be less important than its survival in our imagination. In Rancière's practice of a heretical history of literature, what is most remarkable may be his conviction, and I quote, that democratic politics does not come from institutions, but from eventual actualizations of a project that belongs to all human beings. For him, then, art shares with philosophy, maybe to go back to the issue, the hopeful position that he summarized as follows, and I quote Rancière, this critical practice, philosophy, is an inseparably egalitarian or anarchistic practice since it considers arguments, narratives, testimonies, investigations, and metaphors, all as the equal invention of a common capacity and in a common language. Engaging in a critique of the instituted division, then, paves the way for renewing our interrogations into what we are able to think and do, end of quote. Let me conclude today with a return to Nietzsche, whose relation with the idealist and romantic tradition is at least as complex as Rancière's and cannot be discussed at length here. But I'd want to say that in his essay on Wagner, he had ended up on a pessimistic note, saying that for all of his visionary approach to the future of his own musical and cultural project, the German musician, Nietzsche said, might not have been the seer of a future, but the interpreter and transfigurer of a past. That's disquieting. For Rancière, however, I think that we are much closer to what Nietzsche had previously said about Schopenhauer. And I will take it upon myself to paraphrase him and say that through Rancière, he said, through Schopenhauer, we are all educating ourselves against our age. And this is, in my opinion, certainly a worthy way to describe the task for both philosophy and criticism. Thank you.